You got a sense of humour? You got a sense of humour?
Yeah. I'm trying to. The problem is I've got wireless earphones, so if I smile too much, they fall out. So I have to try and keep my serious journalism face
Okay,
on.
so I tried to get Tim Montgomery, but he wasn't available.
Oh, well, I mean, we no longer work for the same place, but hopefully I can
it was a little joke. Henry, welcome to the show. Thank you so much indeed, my friend. Can I just start by being respectful to you, as I have been to every guest today? We feel this is important. Are you okay with Henry, or would you prefer Mr. Hill? Because there is a council in Sutton, I believe it's a Labour council, has been criticised today for telling its staff to ask people for their Christian names, and they've been said if you do that, it could be offensive and affect their mental health. Most of us think this is hypersensitivity taken to ridiculous lengths, but we need to be respectful in this new world that we live in, Henry. So is Henry okay, or should it be Hill, in fact?
No, Henry's absolutely fine. And this council stuff is just mad, not least because if you look at the criticism and the advice they were given, it says ask them for their first name or given name or something else. And it's like, well, okay, if you're going to give them 3 different options, you might as well have 4, right? Christian name is one of the ways that we describe it. And I've never encountered anyone who's offended by being asked for their Christian name. I swear to God that some of these people exist only in the heads of the councils involved.
But what I don't get, mate, is look at Ukraine, right? Look at the Middle East and Gaza. Look at the wildfires in LA. Look at the rape gangs in the north of England. It goes on. And these, oh God, I'm going to get into trouble from Ryan. These idiots, man, are worried about you offending somebody if you use their first name. It's just the most consequential rubbish you can possibly imagine. And yet these people take this stuff seriously.
They do. I think part of it is just that if you're sort of one of these activists, it's always the quest to find the next thing, and then you get to be the person who thought of it, and you get to see other people having to jump through all of these hoops that you've set up, which must be incredibly gratifying. But I think the most irritating thing actually for me was the fact that this was framed explicitly, as you just said, in terms of affecting people's mental health. Yeah. Now do they mean irritating people? Because it was ridiculous the way that these days mental health used to refer more or less to mental illness, right? To people who were genuinely, for reasons that were beyond their control in some sense, struggling to interact with reality the way that other people do. And then it was expanded to cover all kinds of other things like feeling sad, feeling anxious, and so on. That's all now bracketed as mental health. But this, I'm sorry, if somebody does...
Well, we've got to detract... We've got a detractor, Trish in Scotland, who says, over the top as usual, Jeremy. By referring to everyone as Mr. or Miss, I think you are missing the point of the guidance from the council. I doubt if anyone is truly offended by being asked for their first name, but I could see some people of some religions being annoyed at being asked for their Christian name. I'll leave that with you, Henry.
Oh, it's just, again, I think the question is, who are these people, right? Like, if you or I were resident in a country that had a different religious tradition, and it simply happened to be part of the culture there, long established, that it was, your first name was referred to as your Muslim name or whatever. Yeah, would you be offended? No. I think the thing with all of this is just, it takes a very patronizing view of people of other faiths and cultures, because when you swap it around, when you try to imagine yourself in their position, then the behavior that we're supposedly kowtowing to comes across as absolutely absurd. And yet we instead of thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe in fact the overwhelming majority of Muslims, Buddhists and whatever else are actually quite hard to offend and are fine with this, and there's no evidence of anyone actually complaining, we just project onto them these incredibly tender feelings in, I think, quite a patronising way.
Completely agree. It's been quite an interesting day. We don't need to get into too much detail, but interestingly, we can talk about there's going to be ruthless spending cuts. We can talk about AI, or the A1 as I call it. But the best part politically today was when Sir Drury Starmer was asked twice at a press conference earlier if he believed that Rachel Reeves from HR, or with the accounts, whatever she is, would be in fact the Chancellor for his entire tenure. And he I don't know if you saw it, H, he completely... I called you H, my son's called Henry, I called him H, I do apologise. He completely and utterly, blanked it, didn't answer it. A couple of hours go by, the press jump on the back. Now Downing Street has released a statement at 5 o'clock going, Rachel Reeves will be the Chancellor for the entire Labour government time, which now gives him an even bigger problem, because if she turns out to be as completely incompetent as we all think she is, and he has to get rid of her, he's going to look like an even more idiot. And then somebody told me an hour ago, he's made Lammy the same promise. You will be the Foreign Secretary for 5 years.
I mean, I don't know if Rachel Reeves has any enemies who dislike her enough to want her to have to be Chancellor for the full 5 years of Parliament if it goes on that long. I mean, it's cruel, but it is absurd. I mean, frankly, politicians, if we cut them a little bit of slack, there is never a winning position once the press start asking this question, because either you don't answer it, in which case they have the refusal to answer it is the story, or you do answer it and everyone is rightly sceptical, because we're 6 months in to a Parliament that will run for probably at least 4 years. How many chancellors, ever historically make it? Well, most ministers anyway. You need a really strong partnership. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, for example, they went the distance. George Osborne and David Cameron. But there's no suggestion here that Rachel Reeves is an integral part of the Starmer project, not least because he doesn't really seem to have one.
I was going to say, yeah.
As all of these decisions rack up, she's already trashed the reputation for competence on economic matters that Labour had cultivated in opposition. Now we hear they're going to have to make spending cuts, more spending cuts, and then there's all of this other stuff. For example, she's currently pretending that she's going to bring in a massive increase in fuel duty, which no government has ever brought in. If she doesn't do that, that's another $4 billion a year black hole in her numbers right there. Every economic forecast for the next 3 years is going to be wrong, because they won't include the numbers for Labour's social care plan because they haven't come up with it yet. So she is going to be a lightning rod for anger at this government, and it is, I think, a certainty that at some point he is going to swap her out.
And then we've got David Lammy, the worst foreign secretary in the history of the world, who actually genuinely stood up some months ago and said green issues and the climate problems were a greater risk to the world than what's happening in the Middle East. He's guaranteed in the job as well.
I mean, I think the thing about the David Lammy promise is, if he believes it, it at least explains why he appears to be not slightly concerned about even appearing good at his job. Yeah. One of the most egregious things very early on was David Lammy stood up in the House of Commons as Foreign Secretary, and he says about the deal in the Indian Ocean, and he said that the government has consulted the Chagossians, throughout this process. The Chagossians are the people who originally lived there.
Chagos Islands,
and then they came out the next day, even the same day, and they said, actually, no, they haven't. The government has completely frozen us out of this process. Now, that means he lied to the House of Commons. Now, I don't know if you remember, during Boris Johnson's tenure, lying to the House of Commons was a fairly serious deal, and everyone made lots of hay out of it, and yet doesn't appear to bother Starmer now that it's his foreign secretary doing it. Again, patronage is one of the powers that Keir Starmer has. He has a very large parliamentary party, lots of backbenchers, therefore he'll never get to be a minister, and at some point halfway through this parliament will work that out. He really, these baubles, these senior jobs, they're one of the biggest things he has to cultivate allies and keep his party in line. And by making these commitments, he's either going to look like a fool when he breaks them, or he will be a bigger fool if he keeps them.
It's really interesting. Can I ask you your take on this disgusting news today, my friend, and Conservative Home would have a really strong opinion on this, but I will be honest with you, because the Tories got this wrong. Hospitals are gridlocked, 518,000 patients in 2024. Let's not forget the Tories were in government for half of that time. Left on the floor and in corridors and on trolleys. Ambulances gridlocked outside A&E departments because of bed blocking. They can't get it. 999 calls being missed. I've long thought that it is not as basic an argument as so many people have about the NHS, which is, it needs more money, or no, it doesn't. It needs to get rid of the diversity managers and 16 receptionists. It needs to just tighten up and not take 2 paracetamol out of a packet of 60 and throw the rest away for health reasons. I believe the NHS was a fantastic, an amazing thing, but I don't think it's fit for purpose. And I think people, I've been saying it all afternoon, need to get it off a pedestal, stop revering it and say it doesn't work. It basically was set up to provide health care for people in this country who paid their stamp. It's now giving health to anybody and everybody who arrives on these shores, and I think it has to be in parts privatised if it's going to survive. And I just think that's part of its evolution, don't you?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. The NHS is not universal healthcare. Universal healthcare, the idea that every citizen at least should be able to receive healthcare.
Citizen, do you go to any foreign country and go to a hospital and get it free? No, you damn well don't. We are the only country, which might, my friend, be part of the reason why they come to this country all the time, because of what we give these people.
Yeah, and even if you're not one of the groups of say with permanent residency who have some entitlement to the NHS, because it doesn't charge you on the door, we sort of forlornly send the bill after you when you leave. But if you left the country, you have no reason to pay it. Universal healthcare is great. The NHS is not universal healthcare. It's a specific form of it, which is exclusively paid for through taxation and exclusively provided by one monolithic provider. And I think we are simply running up against the hard limits of what that model can do. Because as you say, it's not just about money. Between 2010 and 2023, the Tories increased the NHS budget in real terms, that's adjusting for inflation, by 25%. The simple fact is that we have an aging population, a shrinking working age tax base, and it's very hard to, as you say, police the NHS because there's no charge on the door for people who have no entitlement to it. So how on earth do you do that? The only way in that setting that you can actually ration healthcare at all is by actual rationing. It's by queues, it's by waiting lists, it's by making sort of firm decisions.
Had an NHS
money is not worth it.
Had an ex-NHS Trust chairman on earlier, Martin Gower, who made a really salient point. I would never have known this, what I've learnt today. He told me that doctors, I bet you know this, Henry, they get bonuses, adulation and a tick if they go from having 2,500 people on their list at their GP to 3,000. Not, as you would imagine in any effective business, the productivity of how many people you see a day. So if they increase in a year their numbers on their books by 20% and yet seeing people drops by 20%, that's a really good thing. That's ridiculous. They should be paid, presumably, on what they do and how many people they see, shouldn't they? That's just one facet. One facet.
Yeah, the challenge with that is that, as I said, the GPs are one of the groups that gatekeep access to the NHS. And so, therefore, the NHS is not hugely keen on having them see way more people. Look what happened in mental health. In recent years, there was a huge explosion in people getting private diagnoses for things like ADHD. That meant they paid cash, but they skipped the queue. But then they were entitled to the medication. Right? Now, the NHS queues for being seen for an assessment for something like ADHD are in some places 2 or 3 years. That's how they rationed it. As all of a sudden, once you improve productivity, once you bring in the private sector and create those pipelines, that just increases demand on the surface at the end, and the NHS is not prepared to meet it. Now, he talks about privatisation. That scares some people, right? But think about this. Some NHS trusts, lots of people in this country have private health insurance, a huge number of people. Every month, those people stump up some cash. That cash goes to a private health company, and most of it goes to shareholders. Some NHS trusts, the big ones in London, they run their own private insurance schemes, right? Yeah. That means that if you have insurance with them, you pay your cash every month, and you'll be seen in a different bit of the hospital with nicer food and a shorter queue and, maybe not, comfier bed sheets and all the rest of it. But instead of going to shareholders, that money that people are spending is directly going back into that NHS.
Right, so that is the flipping answer by a mile, isn't it? That is I mean, there you have it. That's an absolute answer, isn't it? Ridiculous. Listen, mate, I could talk to you forever, Henry, and I really do appreciate your time.